Today we are going to be painting this beautiful little pumpkin, and we're going to start with a large round brush and mix an orange color on your plate or palette. And so we're going to start with some bright orange, some of that medium brown, and then we'll add in some yellow ochre or gold paint to mute that down a little bit. And we're going to be working section by section. So make sure you mix plenty of paint because we'll use this for multiple sections. But we're going to start with this large round section in the front. So you want to go ahead and fill in the whole section. And as you're painting, use the tip of your brush as you're going around those edges to make those clean lines. We're working pretty quickly here because before it dries, we're going to remove some of that color. So again, you're just doing this middle section. Don't move on to the other sections quite yet, and go ahead and fill in the whole thing with your large round brush. Now, once you've got that, I want you to rinse your brush out and pat it dry on your paper towel. And you're going to just rub there in the top and in the middle to remove some of that paint. Now, you're only doing this in the top section of this and down in the center. You don't want to go to the edges with this. You want the edges to retain their color because that's going to look like a shadow. One thing to keep in mind with watercolor is that it dries a little bit lighter than when you put it on. So if you have a dark color, just know that it will dry a little bit lighter in the end. And you're going to just keep removing some of that paint until you are happy with it. If you remove too much, you can always go back and add in a little bit more. Now to finish this section, I'm just taking a slightly damp brush and just lightly going around on the edges where it needs to be smoothed over before it dries, and making sure there's plenty of color on the edges. Now, once you've done that, we are going to move on to the next section. And here's the tricky part. You're going to skip a section because we don't want to work on the section that's right next to what we just painted. So go over to the right and skip over that next section and go to the far right. And you're going to fill in this section with that same color. And for this, we're wanting the top part to have less color. That will show a highlight. And the bottom part to have more color to show that there is a shadow. So we're just pulling a little bit of that color from the top. Then we're going to add in to our orange color a little bit of that dark brown, and just add a little bit of that darker orange with a little brown in it to the bottom of that section. That will dry and it will show up like a shadow. Now, once you've got that, we're going to skip a section again. And we're working here in the back. So right behind the stem, it's a very tiny section, and then move to the other side of the stem and fill that in as well. Now, since those are so tiny, we can go ahead and move to the next section right next to those. So that left back section, and just fill that in with the same color orange. And because that's in the back, it's going to have a little bit more color, but I'm going to take out just a little bit of a highlight on the top of each one. Now let's move to this left section, and by now your front section that you started with should be mostly dry, so it's okay if we paint right next to it. Those colors shouldn't bleed over too much. So again, this is the same technique we've been doing. We're going to cover the whole thing with this orange color. You do want to use the tip of your brush to just get those clean lines, but you are going to fill in the whole thing. You're going to remove some of the color from the top to show a highlight, and then add in a little bit more color or a darker color in the bottom before it dries to show a shadow. And by adding these highlights and shadows, it really just gives the pumpkin more depth. So it doesn't look like a flat shape, it looks like a round pumpkin, and that is what we're going for. So here I'm adding a little bit more brown before it dries, and that's really important. You want to do this before that orange paint dries. It will blend beautifully as it dries. Now, once you've done that, I'm going to mix a little bit more paint on my palette because I'm running low. So I'm just adding a little bit more of that medium brown and some of the yellow ochre. And we're going to use that for our final 2 sections. So let's start on this section in the very back. This is a quick one. And we can go ahead and just fill that one in quickly. And then I'm adding a tiny little shadow and then a tiny little highlight. So same technique, just on a much smaller scale. And then we're going to finish these sections with this final section on the right. And again, this is the same technique we've been doing. So we'll add orange to the entire section and then take some of the paint off of the top as a highlight and add some of the darker paint toward the bottom. I'm adding a little bit more brown toward the edge of this one, so toward that inside left edge, because that's where the shadow is being created from that front section, and that will really make it look more realistic. Just using the very tip of my brush to make that line. I'm seeing that this one is light enough on the top, and on the original it's a little bit darker than the section on the far left. So I'm going to leave that as is, and I am going to use a smaller brush to create the stem. So small round brush, I want you to mix dark brown and dark blue. That will give you a more muted dark brown. And then make sure you add lots of water. This first layer is pretty transparent. You don't want it to be too dark. And I want you to go ahead and use your small round brush to fill in the stem. Now, once you've filled in this section, you're going to want to let this whole thing dry completely before moving on to our next step. So again, this is just a light layer, and you're going to add a highlight on the right, and then go ahead and let that dry completely. Now I'm going back in with my small round brush and just defining those shadows a little bit more with the dark brown paint in a couple places. And then I'm watering down that same color to make the shadow or the ground where the pumpkin is sitting. Now there is plenty of water on my brush with just a little bit of brown paint. You're going to want to concentrate the most color right up next to the pumpkin. And then everywhere else, as it fans out, you want more water. That will make that shadow not so hard, but a little bit softer as it moves down. So I'm adding even more water to my brush to just soften that shadow. Once you've finished your shadow, go ahead and let that dry completely. You've just got a couple final steps. We're going to add a few darker lines to the left side, predominantly, of the stem. And so take your small round brush and mix a very dark brown color. It's just brown, that dark brown, and dark blue. That will make a dark brown, almost a black color. And you're going to use just the tip of your brush with just a little bit of paint on it and make these vertical lines. You want most of the lines to be on this left side to show a shadow. You want just a few lighter lines on the right. I'm also using that to deepen the shadows in a few places down on the bottom of the pumpkin as needed, and a little bit on the top, but mostly that left section of the stem. Now we just have a few more steps, and I'm going to rinse out that brush, and I'm going to go back to my large round brush and mix a little bit more of that orange color. You may or may not need to do this, but I'm wanting to add just a little bit more orange into my pumpkin. It got a little bit lighter than I was hoping, and so I just have barely any paint on my brush, my large round brush, and I'm just going in there and gently adding a little bit more orange and then taking a little bit away for the highlight and then letting that dry. Okay, I've gotten some clean water for this final step because this is a totally different color for the background. I want you to take your large round brush and add some dark blue and dark green and then plenty of water into your paint. This is going to be for your background. Now you're using your large round brush and you can move pretty quickly around the pumpkin, but you want to make sure that when you get right up to the edges of the pumpkin, you're using just the tip of your brush to make sure that you're not painting this blue into the pumpkin itself. So be careful as you get close to the pumpkin, but everything else you can just go pretty quickly and use plenty of water. You do want to remember that this will dry a little bit lighter than when you put it on, so you don't want it to be too light. You can always drop in more color after it's already on, but while it's still wet. Make your way all the way around to the shadow on the left side, and then carefully fill in right next to the pumpkin. Once you have finished your background, you are finished. Let it dry, and I would love to see your work. Feel free to tag me, Brighter Day Press, on social media. I hope you enjoyed this class.